So, Wendell, if Republican policymakers do one thing right, it's stay on message.
That's right. They've got it worked out. They've done well. This last time, maybe not as much as they have in previous elections, but
that was obvious.
Yeah, they notoriously are able to stay on message, and they know the importance of connecting with people on an emotional level. They just don't throw out facts and figures. They know that to get what they want done, they've got to use language in a way that resonates with voters.
Right. It's why people don't think Elizabeth Warren is exactly too sexy and fun. You know,
well, yeah.
Facts and figures aren't very persuasive with some people.
Yeah, there aren't many more people who are more intellectual and focused on facts and figures than Elizabeth Warren. Maybe she'll get it right. I think she's. Let's not say that she's out of the picture here.
But, right. That's not what I'm saying.
Yeah, but Democratic candidates in the past have just not done a very good job, and I've noticed this as well as I've done work over the last few years. As you know, I've spoken to a lot of groups, and a lot of those are progressive groups, and a lot of those groups are trying to get one thing done or another. And more often than not, they just have this opinion that if you just lay out facts and figures, that people are going to line up behind them and do what they think needs to be done. It just doesn't work that way.
Sure. I mean, it's like anything. If someone's saying your house is going to burn down, you're going to go towards the house and try to figure that out. And like, if
Right.
people are warning that that's going to happen, if the other side's doing that, that's very persuasive.
It's very persuasive. And one of the things that I've observed, and I think most people, if you start to think about it, are aware of, is that, for example, the campaign, the effort to enact what became the Affordable Care Act. Republicans were calling that a government takeover of health care.
Mm-hmm.
They were calling it socialized medicine. Those are terms that are packed with emotion,
Right.
and scare people. It's very easy to scare people with terms like that. There was no truth to either one of them. But if you say something often enough,
Yeah.
and say the same thing, be consistent, then you're going to get through to a lot of people, and a lot of people will believe it, even though it has no bearing in truth.
And I mean, talk about the Affordable Care Act and their pushback on that. People to this day believe the things that they were saying about the Affordable Care Act.
Oh, absolutely.
People who benefit from the Affordable Care Act don't even realize the Affordable Care Act because it's doing good for them. They think it's so bad.
Well, in fact, a lot of people think it's been repealed.
Right. It's amazing.
So we're seeing, in fact, the number of people who don't have insurance increase, and one of the reasons is because they've been led to believe that it's bad, or that it's no longer on the books. So it's a problem.
Right. And this week on the show, we have someone that's trying to stop that from happening. He's trying to equip Democrats with the right language to fight back against all the crap PR. And it's kind of like our answer to the John Pudner episode that we had a couple of weeks ago.
Exactly. And one of the things they both have in common is that they both love this country, and they really support efforts to make sure that elections are fair, that people are getting factual information. What we're talking about here is not, from our guest point of view, of making stuff up out of whole cloth and just lying to folks, but how do Democrats do a better job of communicating what it is they support? How can they persuade voters that what they're advocating is really in their best interest?
And our guest he's a pretty cool guy.
A very cool guy,
and
I'm sure, Joey, you'll explain more about what Roger Wolfson has done in his career. But I'm kind of envious because he's done some very, very cool things.
He's sailed the world. He's written for SVU, which he's probably taken more of my life just from sitting on the couch watching his shows, all the stuff that he's written.
My wife loves him. She's a big Law and Order fan.
Lou is a Law and Order person.
She doesn't know how much she loves Roger. She hasn't met Roger yet, but she will love knowing that he's been behind a lot of those Law and Order shows.
Right. So might as well take his creativity and bring it to politics to make the world a little bit better.
And he's done that. And he's got experience on Capitol Hill. He's worked in a lot of campaigns. So this guy seems to know what he's talking about. And he's brought, and I think he has, from our conversation with him, from some of the things that I've learned about him, he's also bringing together a group of other people who are good writers and who know this, who are making themselves available to help candidates.
Right. It's pretty great. It's pretty amazing. And I'm happy to see that we're getting ready for 2020, that we're not just going to sit this one out and do it like we used to do it.
If there was ever a need for Roger Wolfson and his colleagues, this is it.
So, shortest version of my story is that I was a civil rights lawyer out of University of Pennsylvania Law School. One of my professors was Elizabeth Warren. And I found that practicing civil rights law was quite depressing if you're a plaintiff's attorney. So I decided to quit the practice of law, and I went down to Washington, and I became staff of the Senate Labor Committee, where I could write civil rights law. I started with Joe Lieberman, then John Kerry, then Ted Kennedy and Paul Wellstone. So as you can see, I moved further and further to the left in my process. And for 4 years, I was joint counsel to both Ted Kennedy and Paul Wellstone, which was one of the most exciting periods of my life. And for a liberal in Washington in my 20s, it was a dream come true. And then the dream was shattered because Paul Wellstone died in a plane crash. And none of us had an easy time transitioning to his death. We're all still living with his death. My reaction might have been perhaps more extreme than some of the others. I sold all of my possessions. I left Washington, bought a sailboat, and started sailing around the world. And I landed, after about 2 years of sailing full time, I landed in Los Angeles, where I became a television writer. And the first script that I wrote was a West Wing, an episode of The West Wing. It was not shot, but that's how you break into the business, by writing an episode of a good show. And I ended up writing, after the West Wing episode got me office of representation from all the major agencies, I went with CAA, and then I became a writer for a TV show called Century City, which starred a little-known actress named Viola Davis. And then by the time the episode that I wrote ended up on the air, I was already hired by Law & Order SVU, and then The Closer, and then Saving Grace with Holly Hunter, and then Fairly Legal. And then I started selling shows, and I've been selling shows for the last 9 years about all. But when Trump got elected, that changed everything. It meant to me and to many of my compatriots who are in the creative fields that we can't be on the sidelines anymore. We can't put it behind us. It's sort of like, using an entertainment reference, the movie Live, Die, Repeat with Tom Cruise. At one point, I don't know if you've seen the movie, it's really lovely, but at one point towards the end of the movie, after dying multiple times trying to fend off this alien invasion, Tom Cruise just gives up and heads to London and tries to pretend like he doesn't need to be involved. But quite poignantly, the aliens still find him. I think that what we've really learned as writers is that we can bury our head in the sand all we want, but this process is going to find us. We need the help. This is for self-preservation. I don't believe that this country can survive Trump winning re-election. I'm concerned about whether this country can survive the kind of majority that the Republicans now have on the Supreme Court. I'm more concerned about that than the White House. I don't know if democracy is going to make it. I think we're in literally being able to look at these questions and ask seriously, what is the future of this planet going to look like without America, without the United States as a beacon of hope and a beacon of freedom? Because that's not what we stand for anymore. That's not the way the world sees us. That's not the way our own citizens see us anymore. I realized, and a lot of my compatriots here in Los Angeles realized, that the Democratic Party needed to have a better shot at getting its own story out to certainly its own base, but beyond its base. And I started going to Washington and bringing writers with me. And we gave speeches to the entire Democratic caucus in the Senate, and we gave speeches to the entire Democratic caucus in the House, and all the press secretaries and communications directors. And we got invited back again and again, and we started doing candidate training, and we started doing, working with office holders on crafting message. And that has become a huge part of my life, to the point where during this most recent blue wave, I was consulting with at least 6 members of the House who ultimately won by a very small margin. And I like to think that I made a difference, and my group made a difference.
So as you hear straight from the horse's mouth, Roger has a very interesting life, and he really believes that politicians, Democrats in particular, are ready to speak truth to power. He thinks that it's time. which is why he started the work that he's doing. And probably the most important prerequisite for that work, so that Roger can do his job successfully, is to know how each party works, what voters from each side are about, and what do they believe, so that he can message effectively.
Now, again, these are massive value judgments, and I'd be really up for a debate on any of them. I think that, first of all, the difference between the liberal and the Republican, the liberal and the conservative mind, tends to be that the liberal mind, in my view, tends to have a larger sphere of compassion. That doesn't mean that we have more compassion in total. It just means that our sphere extends larger than just our tribe, our city, our state, our country, our populace, our species even. The average liberal cares about animals, cares about the environment, cares about other countries. The average conservative, and I'm not making any value judgment here, the average conservative may very well love their family and their community even more than the average liberal. But I believe that their sphere of compassion tends to be a little bit tighter and more restricted. And therefore, they're a little bit less concerned about what goes on in the rest of the world. That's my personal view. It might be incredibly offensive to some, but I could probably back it up. Second of all, I think that the average conservative voter tends to be a little bit more fear-based. And don't get me wrong, liberals can be plenty fear-based, and we have a lot to be afraid of. But I think that you can motivate a conservative viewer a little bit more with fear than a liberal voter. Liberal voters tend to be motivated less by fear and more by a desire to build something. But that's been my personal observation.
I'm sure liberal or conservative, you're feeling a certain type of way after hearing that. Those are some pretty tough suggestions to both sides from Roger, but this is part of his job when developing messaging for lawmakers, to kind of figure out where everyone stands. But Roger says that the message and political divide in the way it is now hasn't always been this strong. It happened within Wendell, at least in your lifetime.
About 30 years ago, during the Reagan, maybe a little bit longer, during the Reagan years, the Republicans, I believe, and this is a personal view, but I'm sure a lot of Democrats share it, the Republicans stopped arguing the facts. They didn't have the right side of the argument, but they figured the way to win and the way to win people over, and this was Reagan's technique, was to appeal to their emotions. So the Republicans started focusing on appealing to people's emotions, very often their fears. And in Reagan's case also, their hopes. Democrats got frustrated by that because we believed that we were right. We were right on the facts. We were right on the information. We had the right policies. And so we stayed in the left brain of arguing facts and figures and getting irritated and starting to sound elitist and starting to look down on people who were reacting to the emotional arguments. And that's where the real disconnect began. The Republicans knew how to argue feelings because they knew it worked. The Democrats just stayed with facts and figures, and we started sounding elitist and disconnected. What we need to do now is we need to add, I'm not saying we shouldn't argue facts and figures, and I believe as a Democrat that we're right on the facts and figures. But we need to add emotional storytelling skills to that mix. We have to have that tool in the shed, and we have to be able to use it effectively.
Emotional storytelling isn't just something Roger thinks the Dems need to win against Republicans, because again, he's a Democratic strategist. This is what he does. But he also thinks that storytelling and just using the right words will also combat corporate pushback from the petrochemical industry or healthcare, whatever special interests are going to try to use money and spin to get their way. And he's actually creating basically a cheat sheet on language that lawmakers can use to fight back.
And as for propaganda, I have been working on a language guide with the Democratic Party that has the buy-in from a lot of high-profile Democrats, and yet we still haven't been able to get some of my terms out there. Like, for example, rather than call the safety net, I'm recommending to the Democrats that we use the word safety network. Now, as you can see, it's a very small shift. It's almost small enough that you don't notice it, which is frankly what makes it easier to work into parlance. But safety net, what does that make you envision? To me, a safety net makes me think of something that people get caught in, right? A net catches people. It's something you fall into and get trapped in. But a network is something that supports you. It's a group of individuals working towards a common cause. So, and that to me is more what the safety network should be anyway. So we're recommending that the Democrats use the term safety network. There's a whole host of other terms. I also believe that rather than calling things like paid family leave, it should be earned family leave. Because people have already paid into it. They've already paid into that system. So they have earned their time off. It should be called earned family leave.
Roger is an incredible talent and has scored numerous successes, again, even during the recent Blue Wave in November. But there are a lot of folks like him that have similar successes, and probably the most notable is Frank Luntz, who Roger brought up himself. Side note, I think that Frank Luntz is a damn genius. But the most important thing I think that Wendell, Roger, and I spoke about was Luntz, because it showed listeners that there are a lot of people involved in forming our beliefs and in making our political decisions, that are behind the scenes, right or left, whether we realize it or not.
One of my oldest friends, actually, is Frank Luntz. And I'm sure you know who Frank is, and you too, Joey. And I'm sure that a lot of your viewers do. But Frank Luntz is a wordsmith of the highest order, and I respect him very much. He's the one who wrote the Contract with America for Newt Gingrich, and he's the one who came up with terms like climate change instead of global warming, and the death tax instead of inheritance tax. I would also make the argument that very often the Democrats aren't as good at coming up with terms. And I don't think I can really, even though I object to what the results are from Frank Luntz, I can't object to his intelligence. He basically figured out that if you can name an issue or a debate on your own terms as a conservative, because he's a conservative, then you move the ball downfield in the direction that you want to go without even spending any money, without spending any capital. And he's right. And I think the Democrats have a harder time doing that than the Republicans, in part because I think that the Republican Party is a political party, and the Democratic Party, by virtue of its diversity, is more of a coalition of disparate groups. So the Democrats have a harder time singing from the same playbook. Again, no, I don't think there's any value judgment in that. I'm not saying that Republicans are better or worse than Democrats. I'm just saying that the Republicans tend to be more cohesive, more homogeneous, and the Democrats tend to be more diverse and therefore have a harder time agreeing on things. The reason why I believe the Writers' Action Group can be an effective counterpart to what he does is that we may not speak to average voters in a room in front of us 5 slices of pizza every month, but we are listening to our viewers and our massive pool of viewers, millions of viewers every single day. We are reacting what they say. We are learning instinctively how to communicate with them, how to connect to them, how to move them. And I think that that's why we're able to, a group like mine, is able to name things in a way that can really be effective, is able to argue for things in a way that can really be effective. And the Democratic Party is starting to connect to that. That's one of the reasons why we've had good success, and that's one of the reasons why I believe our organization has a really good future.
I think really what Roger wants is for folks to get out of bed and put the pedal to the metal, tire to asphalt, and get out there and fight to fix a system that a lot of us are, pissed and hollering about, but few are actually taking the steps to try to make change.
So I think that I'm saying all this not to, puff myself up. I'm saying this to let everybody know and your listeners know that if you have something to contribute to the political process, offer it, because it's amazing what can be accomplished in a political context if you throw yourself into it and you offer the skills that you possess.